So before we dive into actually lighting the scene, there's a couple different settings that we want to change to give us a much higher quality bake results, and ultimately how our light affects the world. So to do that, I'm going to jump over to my world settings. Now, if you go under Window, and it should be here, World Settings, if it doesn't display, it will open this new panel, and there are a few settings that we want to change, in particular in this Lightmass setting. So by default, yours will probably look like this. If you expand the triangle and the Lightmass settings, this will get us into where we need to start making our adjustments. If you follow this to a T on every project that you have, I can tell you that you'll have great results no matter what. So even though this is per level, so when you create a new map, each one of these has this, it's not necessarily a scale issue, although you may see variances in that with larger scenes, but for the most part, if you just use the settings I have here, you should get great results every time. So let's run through the settings real fast. So my static lighting level scale, I'm taking to 0.5. The lower that you adjust this, the higher your render times, but the better solver the bake has with your scene. And what that means is that by lowering your level scale, you'll get a more precise render, or I should say you'll get a much more precise lighting bake. Now with this, I'm going to jump over to this one, which is our indirect lighting quality. Both of these have an inherent relationship together. And what that means is your static lighting level scale multiplied by your indirect lighting quality should be on or about 1 at minimum. Now, if you do the math here, you'll see 0.5 and 4 should get us 2. So I'm kind of breaking that rule there, but for good reason. But ideally, the best place to start would be set your static lighting level scale to say like 0.5, 0.25, and change your indirect lighting quality to 2 or 4 so it equals 1. Now what I've done in this situation is by changing it to 4, I'm actually getting a little bit more precise render, but again, there's a diminishing return there, so if you have this set at say 0.5 and 2, you should be totally fine. The next two settings that I want to change are my number of indirect lighting bounces, both for the default and for my skylight. I want to say when these come in, by default, they're 3 and 1. For ArchViz, that's just not enough. And what that means is that, you know, if your light comes in and it hits your floor, that's 1 bounce. It hits your ceiling, that's 2 bounce. Hits another object, it's 3. It stops calculating after that point. So we want to crank this up to about 10 for both our indirect lighting bounces and skylight bounces to 10. If you do some research on the internet, you will probably find people that bump this up to say like 50, 100. I don't want to say that they're being ignorant in that, but they just don't know. There was a great article that was done about kind of the diminishing returns of this. I'm going to tell you right now, anything from 8 to 10 or above that, you're actually not going to really notice it, to be honest with you. So by setting it to around 10, on both of these, you will ensure that you both get a faster bake and that you don't have a light that's just bouncing all over the place and really not getting you much of a benefit gain from that. So 10 and 10 on both of those should be absolutely perfect. Compressed light maps. This is one that you need to determine on your project if you want to use or not. By compressing it, it will help to make your package size lower. So say, for example, this is going out to VR. You may want to have this on compressed light maps. So again, it's not trying to load a ton of data into the headset. But you can uncheck this if you want much higher quality results. It's really up to you. You can take it or leave it. And then the next thing that I've changed here as well is my volumetric light map detail size. By lowering this, it helps to get a finer resolution of points. Without going into too much detail, the volumetric light map, when it bakes lighting, is something that helps to kind of fill in the ambience of your scene. If you have objects moving through it, that volumetric light map is what's casting, theoretically, it's not dynamic, but it's what's casting the light on those objects as it moves. So by setting this lower, I think the default is like 200. By setting it lower, it just kind of makes a denser volumetric light map. So in this case, this project 90 works great for that. And the last thing that I want to check is down here. Ignore this one. This is how you actually get rid of lighting, if you didn't know that. So if you check for no pre-computed lighting, build your lighting, it's instantaneous. It wipes all of your light. So that's a great way to kind of just erase everything so you know you're starting from fresh. But the last thing that I want to change is this packed light and shadow map texture size. 2048 is great. It works great for VR, especially for like the Oculus Go or the Oculus Quest. But setting it to like 4096 is fine too. Really don't go any higher than that because that is substantially high on your texture resolution. But that should be a good place. So if you set these settings in your world settings before you build your lighting, you should get a really nice, rich, detailed lighting out of the gate. So, okay, let's move on now actually to the fun part, which is where we actually start lighting. In part one of this series, we covered setting up our initial scene and getting all of our parameters and various different components that we needed to make sure we had the best lighting possible. The thing that I've done in between then, and I'll switch over real fast to our optimization view modes, go to my light map density. You can see that I've made sure everything's within relatively the same range. So I wanted everything with kind of in that orange to orange-red range to get us really the best lighting results possible. Some things are in red, that's fine. Again, as I had prefaced, a lot of these assets were either implemented from the marketplace or they came from maybe an artist who wasn't quite as concerned about laying out the UVs appropriately, but this will give us the best results possible still. So that's the only thing that's really changed in between when we did our initial setup. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into our lit mode. Actually, you know, let's go into unlit mode for just a second. And the first thing that I want to cover is really kind of getting the fun bits in here that we get to see our lighting. Now, before we jump straight into lighting, the first thing I want to cover is kind of this this sky sphere that I have out here, which is based on an HDRI. I'm sure this will be something that as you're doing interiors and you have windows, you're going to want to project that. So how do we do that? So let me go ahead and just pull this window over real fast and show you the setup that we have here. So this is the HDRI that I'm using. There's really nothing super complicated about this. This is one that I found on the internet. I think I did find this from HDRI Haven, imported it, and that's great. There are a couple things though that you need to change, otherwise the resolution in your scene is going to be too low. So to override the default resolution, all we need to do right here is maximum texture size, set it to 4096, and that should go ahead and compress it at the highest. Now I believe this one, no, it was a 4096 imported. So setting our maximum texture size to 4096. It should by default go ahead and import it as an HDR, which is fine. sRGB should be unchecked. And then lastly, what we need to do to ensure that this doesn't scale down, or MIP as it's called, is underneath our level of detail, MIP gen settings, change that to no MIP maps. That will force this image to display at your maximum texture size at all times. So that's how we're going to get this very nice kind of crisp background. Otherwise it would be blurry. Okay, so that's the first step with our HDRI. I'm going to bring up the master material that I have for this guy, and I'll just leave this on screen. I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but it should be pretty obvious. There's a few parameters that we have in here: a rotate about axis, normalize, and then I've taken one of my texture inputs and converted this to a parameter as well, so I can change the scene out if I wanted a daytime, a nighttime. It's all going to be relatively the same and use the same parameters. And finally pass it into a multiply and set its brightness to 1. Now I don't believe there was anything, actually the only thing we did change on the material itself on the master was shift its shading model to unlit. So this will make sure that it always displays, doesn't cast any lighting, doesn't take any lighting, and then set it to two-sided. So again, you guys can take a screenshot of this. If you want me to go deeper into this setup or what we did with it, drop a comment, I'll come back to this. But if you set this material up exactly the way I have it, it should work just fine. And then finally, I've created an instance of this, which is what you see here in the scene. I've applied that kind of Dusseldorf bridge that we have that I showed earlier. I've assigned that as my HDRI. I've bumped the brightness up just a little bit. And then I also have this rotation angle. That actually derives from this material that we set up, which is this rotation angle in our rotate about axis. So if I move this, and we'll go ahead and scale this down a little bit, and I'll kind of jump out of the building for a second. This rotation about angle allows me to turn that HDRI in my scene, which is great, so I can set up the sun position relative to where I want it. So again, I'm not going to dive any deeper than that on this material. If you are interested in that setup, drop a comment. I'll come back to this, revisit, and show you how it was exactly set up. But that gets our exterior. So, okay, we'll kind of jump back in. And now what we're going to move on to is the fun bits of actually starting to do our lighting. So let's go ahead and jump and do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump over into lit mode so we can start seeing what's happening here. So the two things that I'm going to add, which will probably be added no matter what for every project that you do, are a directional light and a skylight. The directional light is going to be essentially what is our main light source, in this case the sun, and our skylight is going to provide that ambient light. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to my modes panel, and I'm going to type in light, drag in a directional light. We'll switch back to game mode by pressing G. And then I'm also going to add in a skylight. So there we go. So these are the two components that we need to start off with. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn off this preview shadow indicators because I know lighting needs to be rebuilt because our lights are set as stationary, which means they do contribute to our baked lighting. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and go into show, and I'm going to go to, I think it's visualize. Preview shadow indicators, turn that off, and there we go. So now it's not going to be so annoying. Okay, so these are our two lights. Now, before I click the bake lighting, there are a couple things that I want to change to get me the best lighting possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on my lights. Now, something that you will see throughout this whole process is that I very much enjoy the workflow of isolating certain aspects, focusing on those, isolate the next one, the next one, the next one, and then combine them all together at the end, as opposed to just trying to constantly layer and figure out what's happening to what. So that's how I'm going to approach this next process. So to do that, I'm going to take my skylight. I'm actually going to disable it by affecting world. So this way I can just focus on my directional light. Now in this one, so I'm going to go kind of rotate it. Let me go ahead and turn off my snap so it's a little bit smoother. So there we go. Kind of give me a little bit of angle and maybe some nicer looking shadows. Okay, there we go. So now that I have, generally speaking, the direction of, there's our sun right there, coming in the window, looks pretty close. This is a good setup. All right, now we need to go in and actually start adjusting some of these parameters. Now, you may see throughout this additional settings. If they're hidden, just click this little triangle down and it will expose those. So if something's unrolled and you don't see it on yours, just click that little upside down triangle. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is go in here and I'm going to go ahead and adjust my intensity. So I'm going to take this up. Now, I want to say, in this case, because I'm using Lux, it should be 31.4, should be kind of the ideal. I'm actually going to take this guy up to about 36 to get me a really nice, crisp, bright sunlight coming in. The next thing that I want to do is, there's two options here. You can actually color your light using an actual color picker. I personally prefer when working in real kind of more realistic looking scenes, I like to use temperature. So in this one we can cool it or we can warm it a little bit. I think I'm going to set mine to about 4400, which should get me kind of a nice warm sunset glow. If you remember, our HDRI has kind of that warm glow. You could also pick a color from the HDRI, but 4400 works fine for me. Again, this is purely just your own call. Make it whatever color you want. Don't really care. Okay, and then the last bit, I think everything should be set, casting our shadows, that's all good. The last bit that we're going to cover, and this is going to be seen throughout the rest of this, is a problem you're going to face, in fact I see a lot of people face when it comes to lighting ArchViz, is it's great that your light comes in, so for example this theoretical sun, it comes in, it hits the floor, and then it just kind of dies there, right? Like it doesn't really illuminate our scene very well. The way we adjust that, and the best way possible, is underneath our light is this indirect lighting intensity. There are a few other ways we can do this. I won't cover those now, but just know, and you'll see me as we go throughout this whole process, this is ultimately what we're going to adjust. So intensity is our first point of contact, which in this case is where the sun hits the floor. So that's going to make that brighter or darker. And then our indirect lighting intensity is what's ultimately going to help that light to fill the rest of the scene. So we'll adjust this. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this up to, well actually you know what, I'll show you real fast. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick build. So I'm going to keep our lighting quality on preview. Again, we don't have our skylight. Even though it's visible here, it's actually not affecting the world. So the only light we have here is our directional light. So I'm going to set my build to preview, and then I'm going to go ahead and just do build lighting only. We'll let this churn. Actually, that should be fairly quick. And then we'll jump back and we'll actually see the results that we get from just our initial light setup without having our indirect lighting intensity set up. So we'll let this bake and we'll be right back. Okay, so our lighting's done building, and you can see immediately the problem I was talking about with creating more realistic lighting. So the light coming in is great. This first point of contact is spot on. It looks good. It's not overexposed. It's not underexposed. But the rest of my scene is pretty dark. And the reason for that is this light just doesn't have enough energy or intensity to fill the scene. So I don't want to go in here and boost up my intensity, because that will change, my first point of contact. What I want to do is actually bump up this indirect lighting intensity. Now, I don't have like a mathematical formula for how high this needs to be, but know that in many use cases, I've seen this indirect lighting intensity go up to 200. So you've got a pretty broad range there of what you can work with. Now, I'm going to change this. Now, I did some tests as I was putting together the series, and I found that 50 actually works really well. So what does it do? That's the magic. Let's go ahead and just build our lighting again. This should be relatively a little bit quicker now that we have our scene data set up, but by simply changing our indirect lighting intensity, you should see a difference here kind of in the rest of the ambient light. Now again, it won't change the light that's hitting on this first point of contact with the light. What it's going to change is the ultimate ambient light that comes from or derives from this light in the scene. So we'll go ahead and let that build, jump right back, and we'll see the results that we get. Okay. So now you can see the scene looks dramatically different. By just simply changing our indirect lighting intensity from this one source light, immediately our scene starts to look a lot more realistic. So pat yourself on the back. You are now becoming a intermediate to advanced lighting artist. I joke about that, but really that is the key when it comes to lighting your scene, especially with baked lighting. That is the key. Indirect lighting intensity is what's going to allow you to push that ambient light baked into the scene. So yeah, all right. Now, one thing I will note, if you notice there's kind of some splotchiness on that, ignore that for now. The reason for that is because if you remember, in our build settings, our light quality was set to preview. That's what this is going to look like. So I can tell you from experience that you won't have kind of these weird light bleeds when you go to production build. However, just know that, early on, I don't recommend going above medium or preview on your light settings, because your build times will take substantially longer. And of course, when you're initially setting up your lights, there's going to be a lot of iteration, testing, and back and forth. So by keeping it on preview, you will get some of these splotches of shadows, but again, those should go away when you go to production mode. So, okay. So this is great. Now, I guess I should take a step back and make a note here that our directional light is currently set to stationary, which means that we're going to have some dynamic shadows, but it'll also bake. Effectively, we could get very similar results with this by setting it to static. In fact, that's what we will ultimately do with our skylight. So I'll go ahead and enable this guy. Turn on Effects World. Now again, this is set to stationary. I'm going to set it to purely just static, which it looks like it disappears. If you need to do some fast testing iterations, switch it to movable or stationary, and what you should get is dynamic light. Adjust it kind of close to the results that you want to get, but then when it comes time to bake, we'll put it back to static. Now with this one, I can tell you that the scene itself isn't really benefiting a whole lot from our skylight, just because most of the light that we have is actually coming from the main sunlight and some of these fill lights that we'll have later on. But for the purposes of this demo, there are going to be many situations where you will use a skylight. So let's just cover that real quick, the process of setting up your skylight to get the results that you want with it. Okay, so jumping back to a principle I had mentioned earlier that I'm very fond of when it comes to lighting, which is isolation. I'm going to go ahead and take my directional light and actually hide it, but I also need to make sure that I uncheck Effects World. So if I have Effects World on, it will still bake in the lighting even though it's hidden here. So with Effects World off, the light stays, but it's not calculated in baking. Okay, so I'm jump over to our skylight, and if you remember, I have it set to static because I want to just be purely just bake lighting. I don't want there to be anything else. There's two different things that we can do here. If you're familiar with skylights, you can actually have a captured scene in which, when it comes time to build, it will calculate and look around the world and reproject that on there. That's great in majority of cases, but you'll probably find on some projects that you want a very specific kind of ambient light or skybox to fill your scene. In this case, that's what I want, because I want that lighting very, very much rigorously controlled. So to do that, I'm going to change my source type from SLS captured scene to specific cube map. So in here, I've got one that I created, which works pretty well. It's got good coloration, it's balanced. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on my cube map. So let me actually switch back and show you. So if I do captured scene, this is capturing the scene itself, which again, this may work in the majority of cases. But for this one, I'm going to show you the alternate, which is using a specific cube map. So you see it changes the coloration just a little bit. Now, I'm going to make a couple different setting changes here. So one is my rotation. I'm going to rotate this 180. I know that again from the initial setup because the sunlight point that's in the scene is actually counter to the one that I have for our backdrop. So if you recall, sunlight's coming from here. In this HDRI, the sun is actually on the opposite side. So by rotating it 180 degrees, I've essentially flipped it. So the sunlight in this HDRI is coming from the same direction. Okay, the next thing I want to do is actually change my cube map resolution to say like 512. What this is going to do is any of my reflective surfaces, so for example, if I take kind of this area here, I'm going to go up under build and build my reflection captures again so it uses that scene. You can see that by now granted, this is maybe a bad example because it's a little bit lower texture resolution, but by bumping up my cube map, so if I go to like 1K, what it's going to do is it's actually going to get me a much better reflection on any reflective surfaces. So, but again, if you recall, I said that this particular skylight really isn't going to have a huge effect, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 512 to 1024 should work just perfectly fine. Okay, and the last thing that I want to change is my intensity. Something that I've noticed, if I bump this up to say like 10, for example, when it's set in stationary movable, where it has dynamic lights, this value is going to be very intense. In fact, actually 0.5 would be ideal for stationary movable. But again, in some of the early testing that I did, by switching this to static, where it's purely bake lighting, I had to bump this up to about 10. And then the second thing I'm going to change, and this should be the last one, is this indirect lighting intensity. So if you recall back when we did our directional light, this is the parameter that's ultimately going to help to push that light into our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to 2. And let's go ahead and kick off our lighting build again, which again will be in preview. So I'll kick off my lighting only, and we can see the effect. Again, if you remember, directional light is actually turned off. So if I click it, effects world is off. So this should be just purely our skylight coming in with our HDRI set and our intensity, indirect lighting with static. So let's let that build. We'll jump back and we'll see what the skylight is ultimately contributing. All right, perfect. So our lighting is built, and again, this is just our skylight. So you can see how it does add nice ambiance to it. So it kind of fills in the rest of those locations. Of course, in this initial area here, we just have these windows, whereas over here, we have substantially more upper windows. But again, everything that you're seeing here is purely just from this skylight. This is just that ambience filling the scene. So it gives us a nice result. Ignore the blotches. Again, that's because we're in production. In preview mode. Production build of this with our lighting will help to eradicate a lot of that. But in general, this is perfect. So when I couple this with our directional light, so I turn this back on, effects world, this gets me actually a really nice starting point for my scene. So let's go ahead and do this. We'll do one last build. So I'm going to click it off. Again, my lighting quality set to preview, and I'll just build my lighting. But this time we're actually using our directional light and our skylight. So we'll see what the two of those combine together, the kind of results that it produces. So we'll let that build, and we'll jump right back. Okay, so our lighting's done building, and again, this is just our just the two lights we have in the scene, our directional light and our skylight working together. And you can see the results are actually really nice, minus the blotches, again, because we're in production mode. This is actually a fantastic result for just using two lights. Very, very simple. So That covers kind of part 2, where we have our external lighting. In part 3, we're going to cover the interior part, so actually adding interior lighting to our scene.